Bonsoir et bienvenue à l'ILARA, l'Institut des langues rares de l'École pratique des hautes études, PSL. Hello and welcome to ILARA, our institute whose aim is to showcase rare and precious ancient and contemporary languages of the world. Professor Houston will speak in English, but let me introduce our institute in French first. L'ILARA est un institut créé en août 2020 par arrêté du ministère français de l'Enseignement supérieur, de la Recherche et de l'Innovation. Sa mission est de sensibiliser et former le grand public aux langues rares, anciennes et contemporaines, et à leur culture. L'ILARA participe aussi à la valorisation et la sauvegarde de ces langues à travers des actions de documentation. Deux offres principales sont actuellement disponibles pour tous les publics. D'une part, une offre de cours d'initiation, de découverte et d'approfondissement en présentiel à Paris et, étant donné la situation présente, en visioconférence. Vous y trouverez par exemple des initiations à l'emessal, variété du sumérien, à l'avestique, langue iranienne ancienne, ou au grec ancien, pour donner quelques exemples de langues anciennes. Au tikuna, langue d'Amazonie, au bagapukur, langue atlantique de Guinée, aux langues kartvéliennes en Géorgie méridionale, ou au manchu sibé, pour donner quelques exemples de langues contemporaines. Vous y trouverez d'autre part une offre de visioconférence virtuelle, l'ILARA en ligne, disponible sur notre chaîne et dont la première série, les invitations de l'ILARA, met à l'honneur des spécialistes de renommée internationale sous forme d'entretien ou de conférences. Dans ce cadre de l'ILARA en ligne, nous avons accueilli cet automne, par exemple, Marianne Mitroun, Scott Delancey ou Bernard Comrie, qui nous ont fait découvrir l'extraordinaire diversité des langues d'Amérique du Nord, de l'Asie ou du Caucase. Félix Ameka, qui nous montrait la richesse du détail dans les langues de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, ou encore Nicholas Evans, qui nous initiait aux complexités de la langue aborigène d'Alabone, d'Australie. Nous avons aujourd'hui l'honneur et le très grand plaisir d'accueillir le professeur Stephen Houston. Stephen Houston est le Dupuy Family Professor de sciences sociales à l'Université de Brown, Providence, Rhode Island, aux États-Unis, où il est également professeur dans le cadre du département d'anthropologie. Spécialiste de la civilisation maya ancienne, des systèmes d'écritures anciens et des représentations indigènes, mais également archéologue de terrain, le professeur Houston a publié de nombreux livres et articles, dont récemment Temple of the Night Sun, publication d'une tombe royale inviolée à El Sots, près du site tout à fait majeur de Tikal, de Maya, dans sa 9e édition à présent, une introduction classique coécrite avec Michael Coe, The Life Within, Classic Maya and the Matter of Permanence, sur les conceptions indigènes maya de matérialité et de vitalité, The Gifted Passage, Young Men in Classic Maya Art and Text, ou encore An Inconstant Landscape, The Maya Kingdom of El Sots, Guatemala, coédité avec Thomas Garrison. Stephen Houston est récipiendaire du MacArthur Genius Award, ainsi que de prix et financements de recherche de la Guggenheim Foundation, de la National Science Foundation, de Dumbarton Oaks, du Clark Arts Institute, du National Endowment for the Humanities et du Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts National Gallery of Art. En 2018-2019, il a été le premier occupant de la Kisler Chair for the Study of the History and Cultures of the Early Americas à la librairie du Congrès à Washington. En reconnaissance de son œuvre scientifique, le président du Guatemala a remis à Stephen Houston en 2011 la Grande Croix de l'Ordre de Quetzal, la plus haute distinction du pays. Stephen Houston a reçu également le Tatiana Proskoriakov Award en 2013 du Peabody Museum de Harvard University. Stephen Houston est l'un des plus grands spécialistes de l'écriture maya, dont il a été l'un des principaux déchiffreurs. Au-delà, Stephen Houston est aussi l'un des pionniers de l'étude comparée des écritures anciennes complexes. Réunissant un groupe de spécialistes, il a organisé un ensemble de rencontres remarquables entre spécialistes, dont vous trouverez les résultats publiés dans 3 volumes fondateurs qui forment une sorte de trilogie et dont je ne saurais que trop vous conseiller la lecture. The First Writing, Script Invention as History and Process, en 2004, sur la naissance, l'invention, les premières étapes des écritures. The Disappearance of Writing Systems, Perspectives on Literacy and Communication, en 2008. Et enfin, la partie intermédiaire, si l'on veut, The Shape of Writing, Why and How Writing Systems Change, en 2012. Ces travaux établissent tout à la fois l'extraordinaire richesse et diversité de ces écritures à travers l'espace et le temps, mais également la profonde unité de ceux qui font ces écritures, les acteurs, les humains impliqués. En ce sens, et c'est un autre aspect qui traverse toute l'œuvre de Stephen Houston, ces travaux sont empreints d'un profond humanisme, et c'est ce même humanisme qui guidera la présentation que nous allons entendre aujourd'hui, où il sera question de la pluralité des codes et pratiques graphiques, du fait que cette pluralité est d'autant mieux illustrée que les différences ne sont pas gommées, et de la polyphonie interne aux écritures elles-mêmes. N'hésitez pas à poser vos questions au professeur Houston en français ou en anglais à travers le chat en direct. Welcome to you all, and please ask your questions in the live chat, share your comments, and participate. We'll gather your questions and Professor Houston will respond at the end of his presentation. Steve, we're delighted to have you with us, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We're looking forward to hearing you on the revelry of science, ancient Maya language, writing, and graphic pluralism.
Okay. Let's see. I'll try to get that screen correct in just a second. Let's see. Thank you so much for the invitation, Andreas. I hope everyone can see this adequately. I hope everyone is well in these very difficult times.
Sorry, Stephen.
Yeah.
Jump in. So now we are seeing your presentation, the presenter mode. So the original way you had it, we were seeing only the presentation, but now we see the notes.
Okay, let me deal with this technical glitch here. And
the original way was perfect. We could see the slides normally.
Okay. Let's see. That is correct, I hope. I hope everyone can see this appropriately now, always these technical glitches. But it's a pleasure again to be here with all of you. Once again, I hope everyone is well. It's been a challenging year, and I hope the year ahead will be much better for us all. As Andreas explained, the institute that is sponsoring me this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are, is one that's focused on rare languages that are generally spoken by only a few today, or as in the case of Andreas, these would be languages that were spoken in the far distant past. Now, these sorts of languages that are my domain of expertise as well are somewhat complicated by the fact that we have no direct access to speakers. That is, they're all dead and gone. And in addition to that, they frequently do not have adequate documentation, or there are only a number of examples. Andreas?
Excuse me to interrupt you. You're still not in full screen. And it's a little bit of a pity because the PowerPoint is so beautiful.
Is this working out now? I just swapped screens.
No, not quite yet, as far as I can see.
Okay, let's see.
Perhaps you can stop the screen sharing and then go back into screen sharing mode.
Okay, let's. Is that working, Andreas?
I'm seeing only part. I mean, it's only part of the image that occupies the full screen. So.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh dear.
Okay. But it's really worth it.
Well, that's all right. Just let's take time to adjust everything.
Well, it's we're seeing the upper left quarter of your image, in fact.
Yeah. Is that looking good, Andreas?
Perfect. That's perfect.
My apologies to everyone here. So we are in beginning a presentation which has to do with rare languages. And as I mentioned just a second ago, these are writing systems that in themselves are largely recording these rare languages, but our means of accessing those languages is through a form of graphic representation. That is, marks on a page, marks on stone, marks on ceramic, as you see here. Now, the relation of these languages to those graphic representations is one that is still something of a vexed problem for us. For instance, we might have hieroglyphic Luwian, which you see up above, which is an example of a known language. The graphs are relatively well elucidated at this point. And then in the lower part of this diagram, you're seeing two different writing systems that are still largely undeciphered, at least according to common consensus, where we don't know the relationship between those rare ancient languages and the means of recording them. Now, the important thing to recall at the outset is that these graphs are material forms. That is, they might be carved in stone, as in this wonderful example from Egypt to the left, or they might be painted on a Maya ceramic, such as the sort of system that I study. This material quality of writing is one that permits all sorts of fun, all sorts of playful opportunities. For instance, here in a great sketch by the Japanese artist Hokusai, you see the sign for long life, but also two Chinese acrobatic boys who are disporting themselves all the way around a fundamentally flat two-dimensional form, and yet they're making a claim on a kind of three-dimensional existence. So there are opportunities for creative expression here. Now, I would also like to mention that there are other features of writing and of these forms of graphic representation by which we access these rare languages of the distant past. Let me say at the outset that above all, these are socially guided systems. That is, the ways in which we decide which form is appropriate for which context is one that's going to beset all the traditions that are of interest to us. It could be ancient Egyptian, as in the Rosetta Stone to the right-hand side, or it could be this letter form, which is being devised for us in the Renaissance, according to the decorous proportions that were thought appropriate at that time. So the social setting is also determining how these graphs are going to be recorded. Now, these are two examples of the way in which the hand is to be held in two very different civilizations in creating script and creating writing. In an English book from 1602, you can see that there is a good way of writing and there's a not, or a bad way of writing. And over to the right-hand side is an example of beautiful writing, as shown and exemplified by this close-up, in which we have the pinky being used in very different ways. And my good friend Dave Stewart has called this the beautiful hand in Maya writing. And so there are body habits. There are ways in which we conduct our very physical persons in relation to the production of this text. The other thing I think worth mentioning at the outset is that reading and writing are in some ways two different acts, but they are always embedded in a social setting. Now, I've deliberately picked this book from a medieval French manuscript showing the female writer, Christine de Pizan, in 1405. Her gender is relevant here. The fact that she is in an elite setting is relevant. The fact that she is recording in a certain kind of book helps to underscore an important point here, which is that these are all, if you will, situated actors. And by that, I don't mean that they're on the Broadway stage or acting in French cinematic production, but rather that they are social beings who exist in settings of broad conditioning, a broad situation in which they are expected to behave in a certain way. The way I would break this down further is to say that there are, in these socially embedded acts, ways of producing writing, and ways of producing it by means of physical surfaces, generally speaking, up into the digital age. We can call this mediation even. And then there are ways of receiving that writing, or what we might call reading, of how one might elicit meaning or sound from the writing system in front of us. And then there is another issue, which is, how are these graphs to be stored? Are they going to be permanently placed on a wall, or are they going to be placed as, let's say, parchment scrolls in a Roman or Egyptian library? This socially embedded nature of writing is one that also necessarily involves a social investment on the part of society. That is, there have to be teachers, there have to be trainers, there have to be instructors, such as Andreas and I are, who are telling people to write in just such a way that is thought to be appropriate for this or that circumstance. And so that's why I'm showing you here from North Africa an example of a student essay that's being, it's an attempt to record this poem by Menander in a way that's going to be corrected by somebody else. So there's a lot of investment here in society. It isn't going to be easily transmitted unless a number of people gather together and through a means of institutions, large and small, are able to transmit and extend the existence of that writing system over generations. One point that many of us have made, including my host, Andreas Stauder, over the years, though, is that in addition to these social considerations that are uppermost in our minds, particularly if we have a kind of anthropological orientation with respect to reading and writing, is that there is a history involved in each one of these graphic acts. And it's a fundamental mistake, many of us believe, to view early writing, its origins, solely in terms of its eventual functions. And a good example perhaps might be the contrast between these early examples of Egyptian script dating to about 3200 BCE, and the very last known example of hieroglyphic writing, which I've actually seen in near Aswan. That is, each one of these has a different set of circumstances by which they are produced and by which meaning and sound are elicited from them. Now, in terms of my own studies over the years, which Andreas generously mentioned, it's clear to me that all of these systems have to be understood in terms of origins that frequently take place, above all, in terms of contrast with other systems that are being mimicked, other sorts of graphic representation. They come out of systems of codified imagery, but above all, it's about humans communicating. And then there has to be that investment I mentioned before, so that these systems might be sustained over time. And then we can ask ourselves the question, which I did with my colleague John Bain some years ago: how and why do these systems disappear? And there usually is a process of what we call functional attenuation, and that the means by which they're maintained are no longer in force, and necessity or the need to create these graphs is no longer necessarily there either. They narrow down to a very limited set of functions, and then they quite blip out of existence. Now, to give you an example of this way in which we can understand these systems through contrast and through mimicry in terms of how they originate, here's something from Roger Williams, who was the founder of the colony, former colony in which I'm presenting this talk. And this is a document, it's an early example of what I would call a contrastive origin of writing. It's a deed to parts of the city of Providence. And you can see here not only Roger Williams and his hand style and his script, but also individual, if you will, hieroglyphs or graphs that are corresponding to the local sachems or prominent Native American leaders who are signing this document. Now, what I would contend by way of understanding writing in terms of history and a socially embedded context is that these may well be coming into existence as personal identifiers, probably in in a form of contrastive copying of what the Europeans are insisting these sachems affix to the page of that document produced over almost 400 years ago. So frequently, scripts come into existence because of different forms of contact, and often it is socially unequal. That is, the sachems and their civilization and their societies are going to be quite pounded out of existence by the presence of the Europeans here on the eastern seaboard of the United States or the British colonies. And it also means that when we see various writing systems brought together, it's often in terms of those unequal categories of contact. And they're often useful, I must say, indeed centrally important to deciphering ancient writing systems, because you might have in instances where many different scripts are being placed in close proximity to one another, that chance, that window, that opening that allows us to make a contact and a link from a well understood writing system to one that is not understood. And of course, one of the great French achievements was Champollion's decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs on the basis of the Rosetta Stone. And similarly, it was the correlation between Maya hieroglyphs and those of Latin script nearby that allowed us eventually to decipher much of ancient Maya writing. It's these situations that are, for us, a godsend. But it also means that decipherment itself, I must underscore as an aside, almost always is nothing that is de novo, that is just generated from a genius's mind, but it has only a possibility of happening if we go from a known writing system to one that is unknown. And here we see an example of how we deciphered, for instance, linear B in ancient Greece, and determined that it was an early form of the Greek language, because we're able to claw back through these contact settings and multi-script inscriptions to a writing system that was well known or understood. So why is it important to look at all of this comparatively? Why is it necessary to view this anthropologically? It's because we are, I think, with this sort of research, re-engaging with one of the important achievements of human scholarship, which is comparing varying human expression across time and space. And we are, in a sense, returning to not an emphasis on the local, but I hope through the local being able to comprehend, to explore much larger processes. Now, some people would take this even further to say that the ultimate search for universals in human behavior will take us back to the far corners or recesses of the human mind. And this is being done fruitfully by scholars who are using devices such as the MRI and CAT scans. But I think, and perhaps I would share this opinion with some of my colleagues, that these brain-based studies are ones that would simply allow us to investigate tendencies in the human brain, but we must always circle back to the local historical inflections that allow us to understand the course of the development of these writing systems under time. Now, another final introductory observation I would make about writing systems is that they are powerful in a sense through their negation. That is, in this case, the Portuguese Inquisition has gone over a book, which was, in this case, about Charles I of England, a Protestant, and they've marked out in a vigorous, almost violent fashion words that they find offensive, a partial obliteration, a partial negation. Or we have traditions of, more recently in artistic creative expression, of asemic, or writing that has no meaning whatsoever, but is pure form. And so it is not only the presence of writing, but its absence that is something that we need to think about. So I've made for you here, in a way, a bed, a set of understandings that will help us to allow where I'm going today. And I wanted to begin the second part of my talk this evening in Paris with maybe by posing a debate or a sense of a controversy about how we are to relate what I've been describing to other graphic systems that have been deployed, often to brilliant effect by groups around the world. And so here we have, for instance, a proverb that's been recorded in Congo and Angola, probably about 100 years ago to 50 years ago. And there's a winter count on a buffalo hide of a teepee on the, in that case, the very cold northern plains of the United States of America. Again, about 120 years ago. And so this is the question before us today, which is, are these graphic systems, these late Egyptian hieroglyphs, which I alluded to before, and let's say the graphs that are being shown in this winter count from about 1880 in a very different setting, essentially the same, or are there alternative ways of exploring their diversity? Why is this an issue? It's because very recently, the attempt to compare these has been enveloped by a kind of moral discourse, I'll call it. And there have been a variety of, you might say, accusations, if that's not too strong a word, that not to see the Lakota or Brule winter count or a proverb carved on a cave wall or in the Congo, Angola, as not to see them as writing as a form of, if you will, terminological colonialism. That is, it's a kind of pejorative act that, and this is a quotation from a very recent essay that looks at these matters, that somehow by looking at these non-European, non-alphabetic, or non-standard inscriptive practices and not calling them writing is a form of violence. It's a form of terminological elision, or if you will, an ignoring of the rich variety of human expressions over time. Now, some people would even couch this in terms of the restorative justice debates that are, of course, dominant in much academic and public discourse in my own country, in which there needs to be a form of equity. But as we take it or refine it more closely in the context of my talk this evening, into a form of graphic equity between all of these perspectives. Now, I'm going to take a different perspective here in a somewhat different direction. And that I also believe that insofar as there are these moral directives, there are also analytical or interpretive directives in which we must continue to respect the nuances, the attention to time and setting that I was emphasizing earlier in this presentation. To give an example of why time is important, let's look back to this document I showed you before, which lies in a library not far from me. Now, we know that these are coming about almost certainly because there's an attempt by either enforced or encouraged to take a local graphic system and to make it commensurate with, to find links with the European system, which is coming in rapidly to dominate the world of the Native American. And so many of these attempts or these documents, these other forms of graphic expression that we're looking at here, tend to have a very particular date. This one, for instance, is from, again, just about 250 years ago. This is an example of a wampum belt, which some people would regard as writing. It's showing the Iroquois Confederacy and the fact that they're being joined together for political reasons. But it's thought that that document, this particular object and the way it was interpreted, probably is only a few centuries old. This is not only true of Native America, but you might also see it throughout Oceania. This is a treaty that the Spanish explorers forced the occupants of Easter Island out in Polynesia to sign. Again, notice the date, 1770. It's as if they're being expected to, they're being called upon, and indeed obliged to create individual identifying graphs that might be there on the page alongside the European signatures that are going to be important in legal documentations of the time. And then as a final example, going back to the plains, these are individual signs, if you will, showing warriors among the Oglala Sioux, again from about 1883. You could see that particular numbers have been applied to them in Arabic script. And if we look at those carefully, they have individual identifying hieroglyphs that are tethered to them by these notional little lines that identify this as the bear who spares him, or iron hawk, the nature of that material being signaled by blue. These are not clearly present until European script begins to make an appearance out in this region. And so there is an historical setting we need to look at. Now, I mentioned before that this is part of a larger moral discourse in the United States. And there's even this book, which came out about 8 years ago, which probably has the boldest, you might say, antithetical declaration, the boldest statement as to what is being done by not calling all of these systems writing, and perhaps not acknowledging that what we regard as writing is not situated within these historical settings. And this author says that we must move, in fact, to a new definition of writing, of equally rich forms of literacy. And so this is about graphic pluralism, about what we are to make of it. But the question I'm going to pose today is, how do we conceptualize these alternative forms of graphs, acknowledging once again that there are these broader, you might say, moral discussions going on about matters of equity, and in this case, of equivalences between different sorts of graphic systems. At the outset, I must tell you, I am not dealing with all of these kinds of graphs that are richly attested around the world. They could be coats of arms, they could be Adinkra proverbs from the Ashanti in Africa, they could be adobe markings from the north coast of ancient Peru. These are dealt with, in fact, in a volume that is now in press that Andreas Stauder is also involved in. So to conceptualize this, before I get to my final portion of this talk, I'm going to look at this question, this debate, in terms of three conceptual frameworks: an exclusive framework, which is a more traditional perspective; an expansive framework, which takes us back to these bold critiques about how we understand and embrace the possibilities of graphic pluralism in societies around the world; and then to a median view, which I regard as probably, to me, the most commonsensical approach, which is integrative. Now let's talk about the exclusive framework, which views writing very narrowly. This is a perspective that is dominant in, I would say, the training of our respective fields up until recently. And it's this is notion that the best writing is all about the transparency and about precise recordings of sound. There have to be clear rules. Everything has to be readily understood and readily disseminated in terms of those socially configured means of training people in how to use this writing system. But there is an implicit corollary here that I want to emphasize, which is it's sound. It's language alone that is thought to be declaratively the most important here. And that's what the focus of writing is. Now, there's a problem with this. The first problem with this more traditional perspective, which I myself held as a student some decades ago, is that the writing and the graphic representation is always about more than language alone. It's about shapes. And if I can put it in a certain way, it's about the fact that we are always viewers of the writing in addition to being readers of it. We're looking at it in ceramic. We're looking at it in stone in these two instances that I've indicated here. And this means, if I can put it a little more flippantly, that the vehicle of these sounds and their meanings are just as important as the passengers themselves, the sounds and meanings that are in a traditional perspective thought to be the primary target. And so we look here, there's color, there's form, there's relief, there's handling of paint, there's ordering. There is a physical setting. There are means of access, either in an archive or in a public situation of these texts. And all of these we need to keep in mind. The second problem that I see with this first more exclusive and restrictive understanding of writing is that even in writing systems that we examine, sound is variably emphasized. And let me look at one example among many. And I apologize for jumping so far around the world and so quickly, but that's the nature of the anthropological game, is we're looking at a document essentially in Aztec writing or its colonial, immediate colonial descendant. And there you see the name of an individual, eerily like the Oglala Sioux identifier we were looking at before, a point made by my good friend Mark Zender in other publications. And if you look more carefully there, there's a seated figure. There's a name that's written for you in Latin script, Quezcotzin. And then up above, again, attached by just the same sort of tether we were looking at before, is a little granary. and along with presumably an honorific that is simply implicit and not enunciated. So there is sound recorded here. It certainly looks like a granary in these traditional societies of Mexico, but notice what's missing. There are names, but there's almost no verbal expression. It's an incomplete phonic record of the whole. And so what do we call this? How is this to be embraced within a restrictive view of writing? I think it's obvious to anyone who's looked at these sorts of documents that reading, as I put it in quotation marks here, is an interpretative performance. It's one in which there's a lot of interpretation going on. There's someone speaking aloud alongside that document. And so these exclusive definitions have all sorts of problems. I think who can deny that this is a successful form of graphic display? It's immersive. It requires a lot of ancillary knowledge, but you can, with those clues, understand completely what's going on. And it also, by focusing, attending, I think, inadequately on these exclusive views of writing, it leads to all sorts of terminological predicaments. This is a kind of writing system from southern China. It's Naji script, and you can see little hieroglyphs or icons that are coming out of a visual system. And traditionally, it's been thought to be pictography and the like. But when we ask a local priest, a dongba, to translate that document down below, you will be accorded this long transcription. And so we can say these are simply aide memoire. These are simply memories to the aide, and that all the storage is off-site, so to speak. But in point of fact, another way to understand this writing is that it's highly abbreviated. And so all of these little words, which I've glossed for you in English down to the side, are picked out up above, and it's the role of the reader, the speaker, in this case, the priest, to fill in these little elements in between. But then it leaves us with the idea of what are we to call this in terms of graphic displays? Well, there's a lot of storage elsewhere, but I would offer the observation that it is writing, but it is massively abbreviated, but it is still indeed a record of language. Now, that was the first framework, which I have found wanting or deficient. The second, more expansive framework, it takes us into the realm of graphic equity with again, apologies to making a mash of all of the ideological discourses going on today. What I'm focused on here is writing, and this is the proclamation or the proposal, you might say, that these are precisely the same, and that this proverb recorded by that single sign, this graph in a highly condensed fashion, is essentially equivalent to what we saw over here. But think of the differences. This is one graph that has many different words. It's almost on a, you might say, a far point away from the Dongba. It's a Naji script, and it's a far cry from some of the writing that we'll be looking at the very end of this lecture. And then compare it to Aztec writing, in which one graph here equals one word. It's the name of somebody, albeit fleshed out through this rich semantic tableau of many different elements, all of them codified. Someone's been trained, and people are being trained in how to interpret this beyond a single community. So we have here years of Gloria forever past, and they're Cuesco only. So what is the issue here? What is the problem with this second, more expansive view? Is that, yes, we get a sort of nomenclatural virtue in saying these are all equally worthy graphic systems, but I also think what we lose is the terminological precision. So that being equivalent, let's say the Rosetta Stone, is going to be losing some analytical nuance. In fact, all of these systems before us have very different actors. They're bystanders, makers, users. They have different patterns of reception or elicitation. And the relations of the graphs to the sounds and meanings are also extremely different. And so I think that a great deal of is lost, you might say, from an analytical perspective by going a little too broad as opposed to going far too narrowly. Now, I'm going to take a slightly different direction here, which is the third and final framework, which will then take me into my test case, which is the Maya hieroglyphic system that I've spent decades studying. And this is a more integrative framework or perspective. And here, I'm going to be acknowledging that many different components of writing, of graphs, are in simultaneous use. And it's not only about sound and language, but there are many other contours or levels of sound and meaning that exist alongside it, and sometimes in vivid contrast with it. There is, if you will, a revelry of signs that is in fact the more appropriate target of our investigations. Now, let's look at myoglyphic writing as an example of this. This is a writing system that is approximately used from about 300 years before the beginning of the Common Era to, and there is some controversy about this, to about 1600 years AD, or in the current era, the Common Era. This is an example of painted Maya writing or calligraphy dating to about 725 CE. Now, what can we say about Maya writing as part of this, what I think more satisfactory, expansive framework for understanding the range of meanings and phonic frameworks by which and input by which we understand this writing? Well, the first thing I would say is it is replete with depictive hieroglyphs. That is, it is in tight relation to other forms of imagery. And this is something that Andreas Stauder and I have explored in an essay for LUM. So that, for instance, if you look here to the left-hand side of this image, you'll see a glyph for a paw, a glyph, in fact, deciphered by my good friend Dave Stewart many years ago. And it reads, ichak, the paw. And then over to this side, kan, or snake. You may not be necessarily conversant with the details of Maya iconography or imagery, but nonetheless make out that these little black spots are the spotting of a jaguar hide. And then these are the little talons. Sometimes they're on display and sometimes they're not. And that's a sideways view of a snake with its eye and then some of the reptilian teeth that sometimes come out to the sides. The other thing we can say about this writing system, though, is it is quite fully phonic. And the decision as to whether to specify these syllables or to attend rather to the depictive logographs seems to be a cultural matter. It's one that we're still exploring, but it isn't necessarily moving steadily solely to syllabic, depictive, transparent records of language. They retain this necessary relation to the depictive world and the words that are contained within it. This is reading, for instance, Yukib, his drinking vase. There is nonetheless, and no doubt that the Maya were capable of recording extraordinary subtleties of sound. For instance, this is from a vase. It's a rollout photograph from a vase that was cylindrical in shape. And on it, we can see here my transcription of the entire context, completely decipherable, of this text. And here I've rendered it into the Maya of the period, which might be rendered into English as, it is his drinking vessel for the maize plant cacao. The owner's name was Screech Owl Quetzal, he of the South. Now, there's a lot of information there, but it's also true that there's a lot of visual data that would be evident in my inscriptions. As Andreas has pointed out in other contexts, there are many pieces of data that signal that there's a rich, culturally encyclopedic world of meaning that's necessary to interpret these glyphs more fully. That's the cultural setting, in addition to the social one that I emphasized at the beginning of this talk. The signs have a kind of inviolable integrity. There's almost an ontological claim about them, that they exist, they can't be torn apart, that they have their own meaningful existence. There is an emphasis or a stress, I would say, on their physicality, and this is true even of brushed versions. And then finally, as I'll explore in just the remaining minutes of this talk, there's a potential for not the Disney-like animation, but a kind of vitalization that seems to be pulsing through these graphic productions, and also the possibility of cross sensations and even of synesthesia of its cultural sort that I'll describe in just a few minutes or so. So let's just look at a few examples of this, and I'm going to just state my conclusion at the outset, which is myoglyphs are more than solely records of language. And I myself have come on a journey through this positioning that I held so rigidly as a young scholar of myoglyphs. Now, recall that this is a lot like Aztec writing in that it's heavily pictorial. And although you may not understand the conventions here, this shows a bird, and that shows a particular Maya god over to the side. There are other things going on alongside the reading of this is simply Kankawil. It's the name of a particular deity in his avatar, or a certain expression here. And one thing that's evident to me as I look at this writing is there are many, many evidences, there are many clues that are present in the writing that are to signal their noisiness. They're meant to be very loud. And how do we explain this? How do we describe it? It's that their mouths are in a number of glyphs wide open as though they're shouting. It's probably an allusion to the bestial or the unpredictable nature of these signs, but I would also say that it is a subtle allusion to the fact that there are oral performances that are taking place as well as pure visual reading, and that there are many different kinds of oral and visual sensations involved in writing and its elicitation. Here's another such bird. Its face is up, its maw, its beak is open, and it seems to be howling forth in a way that would be clear to anyone looking at the writing system who has spent some time examining its forms and its variants. In addition to that, it shows that kind of vitality I mentioned before. Now, these are extraordinarily complicated glyphs in the background. And in point of fact, all of these squiggles and Byzantine forms and volutes, which I'll explain in just a second or so, are simply recording Seven-a-how. It's just a date. But if we turn to this image, you will see it comes from the country of Guatemala, a deity who's kind of in a jaunty, relaxed fashion. Its paw is over the day sign, which itself has a head attached to it. These are the celebrated full figure glyphs of the Maya, which are extremely difficult to read and understand. But if we look at them, they aren't really recording very complex information. That's the glyph for 7, and that's the glyph for Achal. It's a day in the Maya calendar of 260 days that's being enumerated here with the number 7, but going so far beyond anything would be necessary simply for the recording of sound. Now, there's a kind of, if you will, what I call slow reading going on here. We talk about slow cooking today in culinary traditions. This is a kind of stepped, slow, tardy decoding that insists on a pause from the reader, that you've got to step back and work hard. There's got to be some sweat equity, as we say in the United States. You've got to put some effort and labor in to decode it. And not only does it tell us that the picture is more than the sound and meaning, but as Andreas and David Klotz and others and I have reported, the more complicated the visual display, almost of a flamboyant sort in the writing, the more often banal or simple the message might be, as though there's some sort of equilibrium that's being established here cross-culturally. And so it's not fast writing. That is not always the cultural objective. We're not all moving towards stenography. It is about a contrived delay in writing, and it makes heightened demands on people. Now, what else can we say about Maya writing in terms of these expressions that go far beyond merely a record of language? Well, one way in these full figure glyphs is how syntax is being understood, how it's being depicted in hieroglyphs that, after all, can have faces, that can have hands, that can have buttocks even, and all sorts of body parts. And what they'll do frequently in this writing is they'll be able to explain in a cultural way a notion of syntax in terms of human acts of eating and of holding and indeed of interacting. Now here are a series of spelling chains. I'm not going to go into all of the details here because this is not an appropriate form for that. But rest assured that these are completely transparent, that anybody who spent some time working with Maya writing can understand what's going on here. But notice the faces, notice the bird wings, notice the hands, notice that they are grappling with one another. And in fact, frequently, these glyphs are holding the glyph that is to appear directly afterwards. That is, there is a kind of figurative and metaphorical understanding that the glyphs relate to one another not only by their physical juxtaposition, but the fact that they are gripped and grabbed and held tightly and firmly by each other. Sometimes they're clutching hard, and this looks like a rather panicky toad to the side. He looks like he's holding on for dear life, and this rather impatient glyph over to the side, which represents the number, is looking downwards. And we can also have them literally transporting them by means of the backpack that the Maya would use at the time, in which a tump line or a sash that would be placed around the forehead is helping to carry the glyph that comes along directly afterwards. And so there's a physicalization here, not only in the material expression of the glyphs, but in how they're explaining the internal connection visually and syntactically between these hieroglyphs. Now, just finally to wrap this up, because I know people have busy lives and it's somewhat late over in Europe, the glyphs too should be understood as varying along another gradient, which is some obey, some like to follow orders, and it's probably no coincidence that some of these glyphs are displayed in such a manner that they are likened to servants. In Maya iconography or imagery, if you grab your upper forearm, or upper arm rather, it signals that you are subordinate to the figure whom you are positioned with. And so these are servant glyphs. They're being shown in a way that would ordinarily not be communicated by writing. Now, finally, I mentioned before there's this gradient of glyphs that do what they're told, glyphs that are going to follow orders. And then there are other signs that bespeak a kind of out of control bestiality, of which we got a savor or a hint of that in some of the earlier images I showed of squawking birds that are just barely constrained or out of control. And I think all of us who've tried to grab wild animals know that that's generally an unwise idea. And yet this idea of vitality, or the suffusion of life within these glyphs, indicates that hieroglyphs are not only glyphs or signs that do our bidding, but they're also glyphs that might veer off in ways that are not readily under human control. And some of the earliest, in fact, forms of these full figure Myoglyphs, which are, again, the most flamboyant expression of Maya writing, tend to be animals. They tend to be deer, or they tend to be birds, which sometimes are easily controlled or domesticated, sometimes they're not. And finally, there is another contemplation, not only of the contrast between the human and the bestial, but there is implicit within the hieroglyphs, and this is something I think we can readily contemplate in the international setting of these ILARA talks, is that the glyphs that behave rather in curious fashions tend to be showing foreign beings. They're showing people that are non-Maya or ethnically distinct. And the reason we know this is because these frontal displays first seem to appear in much of Maya art depicting foreigners. That is, not people who probably were not speaking Mayan languages, people who were not from the Maya region. In fact, they come from about 1,000 kilometers away in Teotihuacan. But here you see this person staring out at you. And that convention, we do not think is local. And in addition to that, these forms, which show birds looking out at you, are also recording the names of a foreigner. And I think that there's a kind of double punch going on here, in which the birds are seen as behaving in uncontrollable ways or unusual ways, but also that frank regard by which that figure looks out at you is in a record of a foreigner's name that is being nonetheless inscribed on a Maya monument. So ultimately, as I wrap up this lecture, and I'd be delighted to entertain questions afterwards, I've tried to steer a middle route here between, to me, a somewhat simplistic view that all we're interested in is a language beyond. All we want to get to is a record of sound, which might then be parsed for meaning or historical content or whatever. And then this other view, which doesn't, to me, adequately distinguish between the historical nuances that envelop these writing systems over time. And instead, we have to understand that the graphic pluralism by which humans operate is ones that can embed meaning, that can embed sound, but also afford many other possibilities alongside that. There are multiple inputs going on into where these scripts or these examples of writing are to be found, how they are to be consulted, how you, as the reader or the viewer, might be called upon to access some of their contents. And so I would say graphic pluralism is something that requires our applause. We want to look more expansively at systems of graphic notation across the human adventure that lies behind us and is moving forward in the future. But at the same time, let us not deny, let us please acknowledge, I would say, that there is a form of writing that we can call writing that is about phonic records, and that is also a useful component of understanding the potentials of graphic pluralism over time, but also that these graphs all are always in their own kind of material setting. And so I've mentioned before that I am fascinated by the revelry of signs, their play, their wit, and this is something that captivates all of us who study the rare languages recorded in script. There is a pattern variety to it, there is language, but there also is much else besides. And so rather than simply being an act of elision or ignoring what other people are up to and doing so creatively in many parts of the world, we should always attend respectfully to the nuances of writing systems in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Houston, so much for this extremely inspiring talk, and for, as always, putting the human at the center of it all, the wit of these people and their creative ingenuity, and the diversity of things that can happen. We are very happy to take questions that I will direct at Professor Houston.
And again, my apologies to everyone for my bumbling attempts to get the paper started, but I did eventually get on a roll, hopefully. So
maybe waiting for the questions, I might start myself abusing my position and ask the first question myself. So there's a first question which is a little bit more localized, but you showed these foreign signs, which are frontal signs, and it so happens that there's a similar iconographic convention in Egyptian art, namely that while frontality is a diverse phenomenon, but part of it is associated with untoward beings and enemies. Now, there's also a difference because it's more like the fallen enemies that have been disrupted by ever-winning Egyptian king, as opposed to, if I see it right in your case, it is more powerful, prestigious enemies like Sperthro, Ol, and Teotihuacan. Is that correct?
Yes, these birds are, that particular spelling is fascinating, Andreas, because it is a, as I said, a foreign name, but it also has this, you might say, this double impact because it is an owl or possibly an eagle. We're still discussing this matter, debating it, but these are symbolically powerful creatures. And in this respect, I believe the parallel with Egyptian writing is apt, in which there are almost kind of moral nuances about particular beings within the writing of beings that might be thought to be threatening or risky or an endangering. But there seems to be no question in my mind that the frontal view, or what you would call in theatrical terminology, breaking the fourth wall, kind of a Brechtian theater in which you're talking to the audience, is really a kind of bold-facing or an exclamatory statement, because it takes you aback, and the script, rather than looking to the side, is suddenly confronting you, and probably there's some subtle and perhaps not unretrievable meaning that's being communicated about foreigners in general. But certainly the foreigners at that time that are being mentioned in my inscriptions are exceptionally powerful politically and are having a huge impact on Maya society.
Okay, yes, so it's about breaking or deviating from the norm, and then you can break or deviate in either direction. And Egypt, it would be more the face of the terrified enemy, if I'm thinking of battlefield scenes, whereas on the other side, on your side, is more the very powerful, prestigious people.
Yeah, and yes, absolutely. And I would say, though, there's a very late hieroglyph that seems to have a it seems to be the face of a captive, or one who's been tortured, or there's pleasant practices, war practices in which a skin is peeled off, and so it could have had a very different meaning at a later date. And in fact, if you go towards the final years of the classic civilization that I study, the individuals often looking out at you, and it's almost, again, a kind of perverse or fascinating contrast with earlier practice, tend to be tortured captives. They're the ones looking out at you with a kind of visceral emotional appeal.
Yes, that's good. That's getting close. Oh, okay, so in the chat I get few people saying hello: Megan O'Neill, Lindsay Harris, Morgan Clark, and Sylvie Donat. I also get a question. Someone who wonders whether you have any views on the work of Malcolm Hyman, which reframes writing versus non-writing by talking about glottographic and non-glottographic writing. His goal, as I understand it, is to reorganize these all as writing to avoid stigmatizing non-glottographic writing. Is this sort of repassing worthwhile in your view? The question is from our friend Stephen Chrysomalis.
Oh, good, Steve. Well, I'm glad you attended. And again, my apologies for being such an inept presenter at the beginning, but I'll make up for it now with a very lucid response. Look, it's one of these terminological debates that is both useful in some ways, but we're all on the same page. That is, we all agree and look in wonder and admiration at graphic pluralism around the world. And some of my friends in the past have gotten very exercised about not calling these other systems writing, and you can see that this is a topic of ardent debate going on right now. It seems to me that just writing as we conventionally understand it is often about, in part, targeting phonic records. So why the heck not continue with that usage? That is, if we come up with terms that are just polysyllabic, multiple words coming together, I think it's going to be a little more complex for you.
And so we get a warm hello from David Stewart, who says, "Great talk, Steve."
Thank you.
So, well, then I'll go on with another question of my own. So you have spoken about the things of slow reading, of delay, which is of course very different from our practices, or at least our ideologies about our practices on writing. The inviolable integrity of the signs and all that follows, including the ontological claims about these Maya signs and not only the Maya ones. Which here again goes against our idea that a sign basically stands in for something else, that it is a transparent vehicle, and goes more fundamentally against well, the basic tenets of, I dare say, perhaps Western dualism with the substrate and the figure, the representation, and so forth. So I think what binds all these things is also that, well, you have, and some of your friends who are here today, done the linguistic decipherment of Maya, which has been a tremendous success, and now you have embarked for a while now on going towards a further and perhaps even more complex decipherment, which is the cultural decipherment of this writing. How did people look at their writing? What did it mean for them, rather than just for us looking at it? So would you like to elaborate on the implication of this broader notion of decipherment beyond the linguistic part, which was, of course, hard enough, but it's only part of the story?
It's, I think one of the points that many of us have become aware of, particularly through work of colleagues like Dave Stewart, but also the late Alfonso Lacadena and many brilliant colleagues around the world, is how, just if I can use the expression, jaw-dropping, just astonishing, the capacity that the ancient Maya had for recording nuances of language, long vowels, short vowels, glottal stops, even potentially aspects of intonation. That's a matter of debate, but they had no difficulty potentially going in that direction. And I think what many of us have emphasized over the years is how they didn't move in what we would regard narrowly in the West as the obligatory evolutionary direction, which is getting to fast writing, to writing that is only about the records of sound. And in point of fact, they firmly retain these links to that broader visual world that you also have studied in your own research, Andreas. It's vitally important to them. And so there are lots of cultural choices being made here. There's no doubt that certain sites and certain periods are ones in which these commitments or decisions are being variably exercised. For instance, there's a site that many of you might know about called Chichen Itza up in Yucatan that has inscriptions that are just almost remorselessly syllabic. You see a little bit of this in the later Maya books, the codices, the few of which that survive, in which they do seem to be going towards hyper specifications of sound as opposed to meaning. The reasons for that are still opaque. Is it because there are many different Mayan languages being recorded or being used at that site? Is it a kind of trans-linguistic setting? We know that they certainly have a lot of occupants from central Mexico in that location, but all of that is a little bit unclear. But as I said, we all of us start doing research, and we look back with regret to many stupidities in the past. And I have many papers I wish I could disinherit. But I have found this a personal journey, Andreas, which is to steer away from this obsession with decoding sound and getting right to the text, and beginning to look, as I said, at the vehicle, looking at what's in between, what's the process of mediation. And then, because I am, for better or worse, trained as an anthropologist, I always want to know who's off camera, who can't we see, who is there to read it, and who is intended to read it. And these are necessary, you might say, ruminations or speculations for anyone who wants to get more broadly into the Maya reality. And I know this has been a concern of yours as well, that I have, in all my research, and maybe it's an impossibility, wanted to at least pretend that I can ask a Maya scribe a question about their world and about the way they thought about things in that world. And that broader objective is maybe a humanistic one, maybe it's an impossible one to achieve, but that's what motivates me. That's what impassions my research.
Thank you so much. So here we are getting at very deep and fundamental questions. I immediately transmit a few remarks in the chat. Morgan Clark says, I loved hearing you talk about the ontological thingness of glyphs. True for all writing in a sense. Our text or handwriting have lives of their own, betraying meanings not always intended. Stephen Chrysomalis, I certainly don't want to downplay those distinctions between language encoding and other sorts of notation. If anything, we ought to be more specific rather than less about what is encoded and how. And finally, Megan O'Neill, your discussion of the syntax in the full figure glyphs was fascinating. can you talk more about this? Do you see consistency or variation across Maya sites, or periods? So if you want to take up any of these.
Of course, yeah. It's always great to get messages and questions from friends, and including in this case, one of my students. She could also phone me later and we could chat about it. But absolutely, I think that it takes us into the realm of course, handwriting analysis, which fascinated people like Walter Benjamin and others, and as instantiations of personality. And it allows me, in a way, to direct myself to the question that Megan O'Neill posed, which is, where are these full-figured glyphs, and are they abundant? Are they being used at all Maya sites? And the response emphatically is no. And in fact, there are so few that really are understood or well attested or documented that many of us think these are, at least in the longer versions of them, people that might have been in communication with one another, or they might be produced by a handful of savants or people of exceptional calligraphic skill. And whether they're produced first in paper and then transferred to stone is another matter entirely. But they are not common. I do see them as being, in a way, bold-facing, or it's a way of highlighting a particular text. And then it's also, I think, getting back to the question of script ideology that you were addressing before, Andreas, it's a way of penetrating into the encyclopedic foundation, the basement of some of these signs, and then what they thought would be going on about them more extensively. Yeah, Steve, we're again in agreement that I am just, as I said, by fiat, by professorial authority, declaring that writing is about phonic writing, that those two are really indissolubly linked. But as I said in this talk, I want to remain attentive to the fact that there are all of these other concurrent systems. And one of the points I've made in some of my writings over the years is these graphic systems can occupy the same space, where you can have numbering going on that have their own graphs, which Steve has so brilliantly studied, or you can have phonic glyphs, and that many of these have their own trajectory, their own history, their own genealogy, if you will. And I've almost likened it to a kind of cable, a metal cable that would be slung across a bridge, like the Brooklyn Bridge, where you have multiple strands being brought together that actually strengthen the whole.
You mentioned the vehicle again, as before in your talk. It seems to me that this is really a very central key point in all this. So the vehicle is at least as important than anything that the glyphs say in a linguistic or the notational sense. In a sense, one might invoke Jacobson's poetic function here if we wish to apply it to writing, but we do not necessarily need to do that. So you have the vehicle, which is essentially a trace of all the human people that are involved in that. So the makers, but also the seers, because the makers direct what they do at beholders, of course. And so it's the people, it's their worldviews, it is their communicative and addressive intent, all of it being folded into the vehicle. So I wondered, it's a very broad question, but whether you could elaborate a bit further this idea of the vehicle and what it is.
Yeah, and it has to do, I suppose, with theories of media. And I don't want to get back to Marshall McLuhan or other, there seem to be many Canadian theorists working on these topics, or used to. But this is something we're becoming more and more attentive to. One of my teachers and good friends, Mary Miller, who's a renowned pre-Columbian specialist in ancient imagery, specialist in pre-Columbian imagery, years ago said something to me. It's one of those stray comments that still bounces around my mind and ricochets. And it's this idea that don't just focus on drawings of hieroglyphs, get a photograph, or better yet, get up to the monument itself and put your hands on it. And as we all know, as epigraphers, people that work directly with inscriptions in the field, it's often very tactile. You have to touch it. You have to see where the light's going, move your hands along it. And that tactility, that physicality is I would say, one of the primary lessons that we soon have to communicate to students that work with these writing systems. It isn't just a flat drawing, which is inert, it's dead. We can also see this, I would say, Andreas, this physicality, if I can explore this point, in the ways in which idiosyncrasy of an individual sort might be expressed in graphs. And a painted text in calligraphy is more likely to be produced by one person. And that is, of course, complicated when we look at a stone monument or stone carving, which is going to involve hours and hours and hours of someone polishing and cutting and then polishing once again. There could be multiple hands involved. And so one of the themes that I've explored over the years is, what is the meaning of the concept of a hand, that is, of an individual behind a particular text? And that is definitely part of that situated production that all of us have to be paying attention to. They're not impersonal productions to the people producing them. And these are, I think, in some of our traditions, explored better than others. In the Maya case, we have, I would say about 25 to 30 calligraphers whose names are known. And at this point, we probably have about 130 sculptors whose names are known. And we can attach them to works. We can trace their, when they're active, we can link them to systems of patronage, which kings are commissioning which work. And so it's endlessly fascinating. And it's a direction I continue to explore.
And I should say immediately that we have much fewer names.
Oh, really? Okay.
Producers that are known, even though the Egyptian history of epigraphic production is chronologically longer. So that in itself says something about
fascinating.
Not only social statuses, but also ideologies of writing.
Yeah, and in the Maya area too, Megan, I think, correctly spotlighted this, the variability you see. And there are many important Maya cities where there are no sculptor signatures, there are no calligraphers known. And these hieroglyphs, by the way, were first detected by Dave Stewart when he was, I don't know, 12 years old. He's quite the prodigy. And but there's a lot of information in those that indicate that the calligraphers, the ones who are named, they tend to come from an area that's probably the size of the Rive Gauche. You know, it's a fairly small area that they come from. Maybe that was the University of Paris of the Maya. Who knows? But the sculptors are more broadly diffused. But you cannot find those sculptor signatures in some of the most important Maya kingdoms. And there are individual decisions being made, probably by the patrons, as to who is allowed to advertise their authorship, so to speak, of this or that monument. And that variability intrigues me to no end.
And perhaps two more points. So one is that when you mentioned that pretty close to the beginning of your talk, there's all these other graphic systems, an amazing variety. And yet we want not to put them all in the same analytical pot, because analytically they are different. And in a sense, it's even a way to give them value, to recognize how different they are. And one important point, speaking of the moral imperative, is to recognize that they are, and here I'm quoting you literally, they are deployed to a brilliant effect, each of them on their own level. So if I might introduce a very brief personal thing about Egypt, you know that the UJ inscriptions have been taken to be the earliest Egyptian writing by quite a few colleagues. And so, since they are the earliest writing, it makes them very prestigious. Now, there are a few heretics, like your friend John Baines, myself, and a few more, who would say this is not writing. And we would immediately add, well, it's different, but it is just as brilliant as the earliest writing that comes later. They're just doing something else, and they're doing something that is truly ingenious in their own context, in their own settings. By the way, it gives us a view on what precedes writing, like a Burger's shale of things, as Barry Kemp has put it. You get a snapshot into this whole variety that precedes the emergence of writing. And most importantly, and I'm quoting you again, they are displayed, they are not writing, but they are displayed to brilliant effect. And it seems that to me that this is really the way out of the moral condemnation of eliding, not eliding, and so forth. Would you agree?
Yeah, yeah. And there's so many different visual systems or graphic systems that we still haven't completely explored, but which I think are worth looking at. For instance, I think some of it's very gendered. As far as I can tell, just from the evidence available to me, all the calligraphers and sculptors seem to be men. There's no evidence that there were any women involved. But nonetheless, there are depictions in Maya art of textiles. There are other sorts of productions that we think, for good historical and ethnographic reasons, were probably produced by women, and yet they have a different sort of visual system involved. And one of the things that I would love to explore is what is involved, what might be implicated in these concurrent visualities, these concurrent ways of making graphs and of making meaning. Because many of them probably have proverbs attached to them, like in a Shante Adinkra, or the kind of petroglyphs that Barbaro Ruiz Martinez has studied down in the Congo very beautifully, really fascinating studies. We have petrographic traditions. We have petroglyphs throughout the Maya region. We have graffiti, some of which is variant, some of which is fully in this kind of elite mode of male representation and self-representation. And I think that's another world we can explore, at least in our data, Andreas, which is different constituents or components of society, but with their own forms of graphic expression.
And what would be my last question is, so what is really important after this all is trying to, as far as we can, to an extent, see like them, understand what they were thinking they were doing, and why things were important to them, why they were doing them. And so that's what we tried to do. And to a certain, in a certain intuitive sense, we have the impression that we're getting closer to it. I feel that, you feel that much more because you have been much longer than I have at these things. So I'm optimistic. I think we're getting closer. But my question is, if you were confronted with a strictly analytical skeptic, what would you tell him? How would you describe your work, your journey, your feeling even about this sense of getting gradually, slowly closer to what they were doing, what they thought they were doing?
Yeah, I think we have this rhetoric these days of fake news, or any fact is as good as any other fact. It's highly disturbing to me, in fact, in point of fact, as it is to many, I suppose. But I am an empiricist, and I do believe that some arguments can be made more effectively than others. And so it's almost a, if you will, a piecemeal approach in which we explore this point and that point and then this point, and we build up a corpus of evidence that might be in favoring one interpretation over the others, either of a broad sort or of a specific glyph or a specific sign. And so what we also are gifted with is a very rich legacy of living Maya. There are hundreds of thousands, indeed, over 1 million speakers of all the Mayan languages. They have shown a quite amazing and commendable tenacity of cultural continuity and change over the centuries, despite the conquest, despite various forms of oppression. And that is that repository of, if you will, cultural wisdom is one that we can also ask questions of concurrently. And sometimes they don't fit. There's no denying that the Maya as various peoples have changed considerably over many years because of all the pressures on them and their own decisions and so forth. But there also are these tenacious continuities that are principles or frameworks that help us to understand the writing. And in that case, for those reasons, Maya glyph studies is one in which we have almost an embarrassment of riches. We have so much that we can look at, and it helps us to make maybe more persuasive arguments about these grooves of thinking and of feeling even that are also there in the Maya hieroglyphs of 1200 years ago.
Oh, that is, I think, a fitting conclusion. So let us all thank Professor Houston very warmly again for this talk, this insight, sharing all these ideas, for accepting our invitation. We have enjoyed your talk tremendously. Thank you.
Au revoir. Great talk.
And many thanks also to all of you who watched us and interacted through the live chat. So we will meet again in 2 weeks' time, Thursday the 28th at 8 p.m., this time on the ancient Near East, and more specifically ancient Anatolia, present-day Turkey, with Professor Theo van den Hout from the University of Chicago, speaking on late but twice literate writing and reading Hittite Anatolia, 1650 to 1200 BC. See you Thursday in 2 weeks' time.
Okay.